Taiwan as a bargaining chip, deal or no deal from China?
Absolutely no. China, actually, there are many things the two countries can make a deal on bargain based on the mutual concessions. But however, some of the issues, especially Taiwan issue, is not at this category. Taiwan issue is the core interest during the past 4 decades. This issue has been always the most important, most sensitive, and the most explosive issue.
So that's the bottom line of China?
No. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Rubin, why do you think Mr. Trump, the president-elect, push on what both sides have for decades believed in as the bottom line? Does he want to surprise? Does he want to fundamentally change things? Or he just want to test water?
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And I do want to start by also stating that the American people have warm feelings for the Chinese people, that what we are watching now in the political rhetoric does not match the people-to-people engagements over years. Personally, my children study Mandarin at a public school. Our public schools support this educational program. So I want to make sure that as we engage in this, that we remember that, because the context for Donald Trump's words do matter. This election season, both political parties raised the negative rhetoric towards China, in particular as related to the economy. It happened on both sides. But what is distinct now is with Trump engaging not just on economic issues, but on core national security issues. And that is a problem. It's very unsettling to have a president-elect publicly stating opposition to a 4 decades old bipartisan policy without a real endgame in mind. So it has much of the national security community very much baffled about where this is heading. Certainly we need that clarity to be sure that this doesn't evolve in a direction that could be dangerous for both parties.
Well, Mr. Rubin, I have to say, thank you so much for being a messenger of friendship, but probably the president-elect doesn't think the same way as you did. That's the problem. Professor Ross, therefore I go to you. Does Washington or the United States, politically speaking, has a mechanism to rein in wild card like your president-elect, Mr. Trump, in terms of its policies? If you have some ideas, help us to understand it.
Well, there are very few things the United States people, public opinion, or Congress can do in the short term to restrain the president when it comes to diplomacy, including such issues as the One China principle, U.S. policy toward Taiwan, toward the mainland. And so before he gets restrained, we may find ourselves in a difficult position. After all, he's appointed many members of the administration who have no experience in dealing with China, dealing with East Asia, dealing with diplomacy. Members of his administration coming from the business sector who are accustomed to getting their way as CEOs of major corporations. So we may go through a difficult period as they learn that other countries have their interests and their abilities, and China can say no. And until that happens, until they learn and gain experience, we may find ourselves with a president who does not exercise restraint.
And therefore, Mr. Rubin, here's the issue. How much both sides have to suffer if following what Professor Ross just mentioned, before the two sides could settle down once again to the original bottom line? Can we afford learning curve like this for a president-elect such as Mr. Trump?
Well, I certainly hope we won't have to suffer, but I do agree with the professor and with the premise of your question that there will be a learning curve. And currently the team that the president-elect has put in, his national security advisor, his secretary of defense, now his Secretary of State, it's not at all clear what their views will be on China. And as well, there are real national security dilemmas that are coming up, and they always tend to come up at the beginning of a new president's term. We remember this with George W. Bush as well in the first several months, the incident with the American fighter craft and how that was dealt with a very calm hand in Secretary of State Colin Powell. We're not sure we have those same calm hands right now, and that's the big concern in Washington, is that once one begins to unravel long-standing policies that keep the peace, it's not clear that it has to end in a good place.
Mr.
And
Yang.
so it's critical it's critical to have these conversations publicly now.
Mr. Yang, if Washington, let's just say President Trump, when he comes into office, want to scrap off this bottom line, does that mean the overall picture of U.S.-China relations from China's perspective is likely to change? Of course, you are not representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you are not representing the administration here in China, but I want to get you from a Chinese intellect and public opinions perspective.
Well, first of all, if U.S. Make the breaking of the bottom line, that means the overall bilateral relation will fall in the totally different state, say, strategic confrontation. That will trigger countless confrontations and contradictions between the two big countries from the economic, political, even military. And the two countries will return to a new type of Cold War, if not hot war. So under the new Cold War between China and the U.S., whenever U.S. challenge China, that means U.S. is being challenged by China. U.S. being challenged by China. So in the negative strategic interaction, will put not only the bilateral relation but also the regional and the global world in a worse situation.
Professor Ross, can you imagine other governments, when they have the new president, totally scrap off the very bottom line of a bilateral relations, which has been there from day one, and put a total spin to the relations? What would that mean for U.S. when it comes to its capability of foreign policy? Will this, in a way, scrap off the overall credibility of the United States, at least here in China, I have to say, or this part of Asia, about what the U.S. have in mind? After all, it's the president that you have elected.
Well, first of all, I'd like to add a little moderation to this conversation. I don't think we'll be looking forward to a new Cold War in U.S.-China relations. The U.S.-China relationship is very different than anything we saw in the U.S.-Soviet relationship during the Cold War. But to your question, yes, after all, the United States had a very different approach to China under Ronald Reagan, very different approach to China under Bill Clinton. So yes, our presidents have different perspectives as they come into office, and they do seek to add their own imprint on U.S.-China relations. But of course, China has gone through its own successions, and many people in the United States feel that Xi Jinping is very different than Hu Jintao, and his policies in East Asia are very different, and were quite a surprise to the United States, and had a major effect on our understanding of China.
So you're thinking...
Today we're dealing with a president-elect. Yes?
So you are suggesting,
I'm
Professor
thinking that
Ross,
we have a new president, but it's not that unusual.
So you're suggesting, Professor Ross, that is what the rhetoric coming from President-elect Mr. Trump might be acceptable, even to, let's just say, intellects like you who are dealing with China for long term. So you're suggesting why not? Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I said. No, I'm responding to your presentation where you said this is, when could it ever happen that a new leader would turn policy? And I'm suggesting that's not uncommon in the world. That's not to say it's acceptable or necessarily constructive or helpful to either the United States or China. That's two very different things.
All right.
What President-elect Trump would like to do is say we need a deal on Taiwan. After all, we had a deal on Taiwan, as you suggested in your opening, in January 1979. The dilemma he faces is that he wants to reopen this deal, renegotiate. The problem he faces is that, of course, the Chinese economy is far stronger than it was in 1979. The Chinese Navy is far stronger. So the idea that we could get a better deal today than we had in 1979, that stretches the imagination. And as I suggested earlier, the Chinese government, the Chinese people are going to be reluctant to make new compromises in the context of a stronger, more capable China.
Mr. Rubin, do you agree with what Professor Ross just mentioned? It seems to me he's talking about the powers of the relations, namely, but not necessarily credibility involved in the trust of the relation. Of course, we lack strategic trust already between China and the United States, but if this bottom line is being reopened again, the wound is open to the air again. So I want to fundamentally ask you a question. The relations between China and the United States, does it have anything to do with trust? Will it have anything to do with trust? Or it's totally about power from now on?
Well, I think it's essential to recognize that relations amongst states are always about interests and perspectives and whether or not agreements can be made that advance those interests and whether those can be verifiable. And certainly in the case of the US and China, for example, for many years there was debate about climate change, and eventually we saw both sides come together in a very constructive bilateral agreement on reducing carbon emissions that advances both countries' goals, or at least did in the previous administration. Now the challenge is that with a new administration coming in, like that of Donald Trump, and the types of individuals that he's appointing, is that it will be very different from President Obama's administration. And this back and forth, I understand it can be very unsettling and very challenging. What we need to make sure we're doing is not personalizing the debates between states. All that said, when President-elect Trump puts out tweets about long-standing policy that does contribute to stability and does not have a backup plan for what's next, it is destabilizing. And it is troubling. And certainly the Taiwan policy does have a lot of support for change amongst congressional Republicans. This is not out of no context, but what is the day after plan? And that's the issue that I'm looking for from this new Trump team, is what is their strategy? What is their day after? What next when they make an assertion over policy? We have real interest with China, issues such as nuclear proliferation in the region, North Korea, the South China Sea, relations across South Asia as well, into Africa. There are major issues that we have to deal with China, and my hope is that we will get through this period of personalization into real discussions diplomatically on hard issues. But if it's pure power alone, that won't cut it. That won't be enough.
It is no secret that some of the members of the Republican congressmen and women might be supporting a very different approach toward Taiwan that has been there for decades. But only this president-elect, running up to the White House, raised that up and totally changed it in a very different direction. That is something new. Meanwhile, policy change from presidents in the United States is not new, and yet dramatic policy change from the president of the United States, particularly for the long run, is very rare, to say the least. So, Mr. Yang, listening to your counterparts coming from the US that have been dealing with China for some time and their reflections about Mr. Trump's rhetorics, what do you make of the wind, the direction of the wind? Is Beijing going to be prepared for it?
Well, first of all, China has a full strategic confidence in one China policy principle in China-US relation. During the past 4 decades, from Nixon to now, there have been 8 presidents from both of the parties with quite varied political, ideological background and understandings. But the varied presidents have gone along the same one China principle policy. So the 9th president since Nixon, Mr. Trump, I believe, will basically go along this direction simply because that fit to the U.S. national interest. So the American national interest will refrain Trump from going too far away. But on the other hand, we really prepare for the worst situation.
What is likely to be the worst situation? How is China going to prepare for the worst situation, Mr. Yang, if I could borrow some of your wisdom?
Well, for political, economic, and military exchanges, I think will be deadly damaged and reduced. I mentioned that the new type of Cold War. That means U.S. and China, when the total bilateral relation fall in the strategic confrontation, every area cooperation will be damaged and impeded.
The whole taste would be changed.
Yeah,
We talk about trade, both of our two both our two American guests. Let's talk about trade a little bit. Trump has always been harps on the big trade deficit between China and the United States, saying China is stealing American jobs. Let's take a look at some of the numbers. 2015, this year, China exported $300 billion more to the United States than U.S. did to China. He has been talking about that. China has more to lose in terms of total trade volume, but the types of goods it sells to the U.S. are harder to source elsewhere. The three largest categories of goods China buys from the U.S. are soybeans, gentlemen, cars, and aircraft, all of which could be sourced elsewhere. The three biggest types that the U.S. imports from China are mobile phones, laptops, network equipment. In each case, China is the dominant global supplier, producing about 70% of the world output. So, we're not suggesting there's likely to be a huge trade war, but certainly when you look at the categories, Professor Ross, of what each side have been providing each other, has been interesting. Soybeans directly going to the States, in which Mr. Trump, the president-elect, has won the electoral votes.
Well, I think there are a number of factors here. Your reference to China being able to source elsewhere is, of course, important. But simultaneously, we should also understand that China depends on the American market for its GDP. About 3 times more the United States depends on the Chinese market. So that the level of dependency on both countries in this relationship is fairly significant. I can't imagine that Chinese retaliation against America would be any more damaging to America than a trade war would be to China. So here, the lesson here is not that one country has more leverage than the other. The issue here is that both countries would suffer considerably. And as you suggest, Chinese retaliatory capabilities are quite strong, whether it's Buicks in China, whether it's Boeing aircraft, whether it's agricultural purchasing from the United States. Once again, the last time the Chinese and the Americans had issues in which the United States threatened China with trade sanctions, the Americans found themselves in a very uncomfortable position, and essentially President Clinton blinked before Chinese pressure. Again, as China's economy has grown and its mutual dependence has grown stronger, it's difficult to see how the United States could drive a better bargain and would have greater leverage to compel Chinese compromises.
I see your point. Mr. Rubin, your thoughts here.
Nobody wins in a trade war. We have to be very blunt. And trade wars can evolve into more aggressive dynamics. We do not need to see military conflict between the U.S. and China. Nobody wants that outcome. But part of avoiding any potential for that, as well as a trade war, is to identify areas of cooperation. That said, what the American people voted for, not just in the general election, but really in the primaries as well, and you saw it in the Democratic primary as well, is an economic policy that does deal differently with issues of trade. Now, President Obama had the Trans-Pacific Partnership Program, that deal front and center at the end of his presidency. Both candidates opposed it. That was a strategic move as well by the president. So now it's a big unknown. We don't really know what the policies are. Picking trade wars absent a broader policy is not going to be in either country's interest.
Right. Mr. Yang, before we go, final words from you as well. Trade war hurt everyone. Yep. We all know that. But there is a bottom line that both sides have to hold on to. So from now until January the 20th, rather, how will China react to continuous, it seems, rhetorics coming from the president-elect before he becomes the real American president?
Well, in terms of the rhetoric wordings from Trump, China will wait and see. But words from White House will be the different matter. So China, on one hand, prepare for cooperation, but also make a full preparation for the possible confrontation made by Mr. Trump.